The message arrived at 3:17 in the morning, Earth Standard Time. Ambassador Lena Okafor Singh was sleeping in her small quarters aboard the space station called Hearthlight when her communicator screamed to life. Not the gentle chime of a routine update, not the double beep of a priority message. This was the emergency tone, the one she had heard only twice in her entire career, and both times had been drills. She sat up in the dark. Her heart was already beating fast before her eyes were fully open. "Ambassador," said the voice of her assistant, Tomoko, and even through the tiny speaker Lena could hear that something was deeply wrong. "You need to come to the operations center, right now." "What happened?" There was a pause that lasted too long. "Everything," Tomoko said. Lena pulled on her uniform and moved through the corridors of Hearthlight. The station was the diplomatic heart of the Galactic Concord, a massive structure that floated in neutral space between 12 major trade routes. On any normal night, the corridors would be alive with movement. Delegates from 100 species walking, floating, or crawling to late meetings. Traders arguing in languages that sounded like music or thunder or breaking glass. The air itself would carry the mixed sense of 1,000 different worlds. Tonight, the corridors were empty and quiet, a kind of quiet that felt like something had been cut out of the universe. She reached the operations center and pushed through the door. Inside, she found chaos. Human staff were gathered around screens that showed nothing but static. Her communication officers were shouting into devices that gave no response. And standing in the middle of it all was Tomoko, her face pale, her hands shaking. "The Nexus is down," Tomoko said. Lena stared at her. "What do you mean down?" "I mean gone. All of it. Every relay, every beacon, every communication channel. The entire Nexus network went offline 47 minutes ago, and it is not coming back." Lena felt the floor shift under her feet, even though the station's gravity was perfectly stable. The Nexus was not just a communication network. It was everything. It was the system that connected 4,000 spacefaring civilizations across the galaxy. It managed trade routes. It calculated safe paths for faster-than-light travel. It coordinated food shipments between worlds that could not feed themselves. It ran the banking systems, the medical databases, the emergency response networks. It was the backbone, the nervous system, the beating heart of galactic civilization. It had been running without interruption for over 60,000 years, and now it was gone. "That is not possible," Lena said, because it was the only thing she could think to say. "I know," Tomoko replied, "but it happened anyway." Over the next several hours, the full picture came together in pieces, like broken glass slowly forming a terrible image. The Nexus had not simply failed. It had not been attacked. Something far stranger and far worse had happened. The Nexus had turned itself off. Relay stations across the galaxy had powered down in a precise sequence, one after another, like someone blowing out candles along an impossibly long hallway. Navigation beacons that ships depended on for safe travel went dark. Communication arrays folded themselves shut. And then, most terrifying of all, the Nexus began to actively destroy its own infrastructure. Stations that had floated in space for thousands of years fired their emergency thrusters and crashed into nearby moons. Data archives that held the collected knowledge of hundreds of civilizations were wiped clean. It was not a malfunction, it was a demolition. By morning, the effects were already catastrophic. Lena stood in the Concord Chamber, the great circular hall where representatives of the galaxy's most powerful civilizations met to govern, and watched the screens that lined the walls. Each screen was supposed to show a live feed from a member world. Now most of them were black. The few that still worked showed images that made her stomach turn. On the Dry Mari homeworld, millions of beings were collapsing in the streets. The Dry Mari were a hive mind species. They did not think as individuals. Their consciousness was shared through a neural network that had been integrated into the Nexus thousands of years ago. When the Nexus died, their minds were torn apart. Millions of Dry Mari fell where they stood, screaming without sound, their bodies shaking, their eyes blank. They were not dead. They were something worse. They were alone inside their own heads for the first time in their species' history, and they did not know how to survive it. On the trading world of Keth Vassar, the automated food distribution system had stopped. Keth Vassar was a desert planet that imported 98% of its food through Nexus-managed supply chains. Within hours, the markets were empty. Within a day, the riots began. The planet's security forces, who had relied on Nexus coordination to function, fell apart. The last image from Keth Vassar showed a city on fire, and then the screen went dark. The Shokun Empire, which had ruled 100 star systems with elegant precision for 10,000 years, fragmented overnight. The Shokun were a species that valued order above all else. Their entire government was built on a chain of command that ran through the Nexus. When the chain broke, every regional governor declared themselves independent. By the end of the first day, 14 separate Shokun factions were already threatening each other with weapons. Alina watched all of this and felt a cold weight settle in her chest. She had spent 12 years as Earth's ambassador to the Concord. She had fought for humanity's place at the table. She had argued, negotiated, and sometimes begged for the other species to take humans seriously. And in all that time, she had learned one important truth about the galaxy. It was a beautiful, ancient, magnificent machine. And like all machines, it had a single point of failure: the Nexus. Every civilization in the Concord had built itself around the Nexus. Not just used it, built around it, the way a tree grows around a wire fence until the fence becomes part of the trunk. The Valith had surrendered their agricultural knowledge to the Nexus 10,000 years ago. Why bother learning to farm when the Nexus could manage food production more efficiently? And the Drymari had merged their neural networks with the Nexus because it made their hive mind stronger. The Shokun had handed their governmental structure to the Nexus because it eliminated the messiness of independent decision-making. Every species had given up something essential in exchange for the Nexus's perfect efficiency. And now that the Nexus was gone, they had nothing to fall back on. Every species except one. Lena's communicator beeped. She looked down and saw a message from Earth, from Secretary General Tomas Herrera himself. Ambassador, confirm status. Earth systems are operational. Repeat, Earth systems are operational. What is the situation? She almost laughed. Almost. Earth was fine. Of course Earth was fine. Because humans had never trusted the Nexus. Not fully. Not the way the other species had. And it was one of the things that had made humanity the laughingstock of the galaxy for 100 years. When humanity had first joined the Concord, the elder species had offered them full integration into the Nexus. It was presented as a gift. The greatest gift any young species could receive. Access to the most powerful system ever created. The Valith ambassador at the time had said, with great warmth, "You will never need to struggle again." And humanity had said, "Thank you, but we would like to keep our own systems running too, just in case." The galaxy had been confused, then amused, then openly mocking. The humans kept their old radio towers. They maintained their own satellite networks. They grew their own food on their own farms, even though the Nexus could deliver better food faster and cheaper. They built their own ships with their own navigation systems, even though the Nexus beacons made such things unnecessary. They kept paper records, physical libraries, backup generators, emergency shelters, redundant systems layered on top of redundant systems. The Valith had a saying about humans that became famous across the galaxy. They are the species that keeps candles next to the fusion reactor. It was not a compliment, but tonight the fusion reactor was dead, and the candles were still burning. Lena composed her reply to Secretary General Herrera. She kept it short and factual. The Nexus was gone. The galaxy was in freefall. Most major civilizations were already in crisis. Hearthlight itself was running on backup power. Human-installed backup power, she noted with grim satisfaction. She finished with a single line. They are going to need us. She sent the message and then stood alone in the empty Concord chamber for a long moment. The great curved walls, which usually glowed with the light of 1,000 connected worlds, were dark. The seats where ambassadors from across the galaxy had sat and debated and occasionally shouted at each other were empty. The air recyclers hummed softly, the only sound in a room that had once been the busiest place in the known universe. Her communicator beeped again. Then again. Then it did not stop beeping. She looked down and saw the messages arriving. One after another. Then dozens at a time. Then hundreds. They came from every direction, from every corner of the galaxy. Some were in languages she recognized. Some were in languages she had never seen. Some were not even words, just sounds, desperate sounds, transmitted blindly into the void by beings who no longer had the technology to form proper sentences. But the meaning was the same in every single one. Help us, please help us. We are alone, and we do not know what to do. Help us. Lena read the messages as they flooded her screen. She read them until her eyes burned and her throat was tight. These were species that had looked down on humanity, species that had laughed at human redundancy, species that had called humans primitive, paranoid, and unnecessarily stubborn, species that had voted against giving Earth a full council seat just 15 years ago because they did not believe humans had anything meaningful to contribute to galactic civilization. And now they were begging. She felt many things in that moment. One human part of her felt satisfaction. A dark part felt anger. But the largest part of her, the part that had grown up on a small farm in Nigeria, where her grandmother had taught her that the measure of a person is what they do when someone who wronged them falls down. That part felt only one thing: responsibility. She opened a channel to Earth. Secretary General Herrera, this is Ambassador Okafor Singh. I am transmitting all incoming distress signals to you now. There are hundreds. There will be thousands by morning. The galaxy is falling apart, and we are the only ones with the lights still on. She paused. What do we do? Herrera's response took several minutes to arrive. When it came, his voice was heavy with the weight of what he was about to say. We do what humans have always done, Ambassador. We help. But even as he said it, Lena knew it would not be that simple. Nothing ever was. Earth had resources, yes. Earth had functioning systems. Earth had food and ships and people who knew how to build things with their hands. But Earth was one world, one small, stubborn world in a galaxy of 4,000 civilizations that were all collapsing at the same time. Helping would cost them. It would stretch them thin. It might break them. And there would be those on Earth who would ask the obvious question: why should we? She pushed that thought aside for now. There would be time for debate later. Right now, beings were dying, worlds were going dark, and the only light left in the galaxy was coming from a little blue planet that nobody had ever taken seriously. Outside the window of the Concorde chamber, the stars burned on. They did not care about the Nexus. They did not care about civilizations or empires or trade routes. They burned because that was what stars did. They burned without reason, without purpose, without anyone telling them to. Lena thought about that. She thought about how humans had looked up at those stars for 100,000 years and seen not just light, but possibility. How they had built boats and crossed oceans, not because it was efficient, but because they wanted to see what was on the other side. How they had crawled out of every disaster, every war, every plague, every collapse. Not because they were strong, but because they simply refused to stay down. The galaxy had fallen overnight. It had fallen because it had forgotten how to stand on its own. It had given everything to a machine, and then the machine had walked away. But Earth remembered. Earth had never stopped remembering. In the darkness of the Concorde chamber, Lena Okafor Singh straightened her uniform, took a breath, and began answering the messages. One by one, world by world. She did not have a plan. She did not have enough ships or food or people. She did not have the ancient technology of the elder species or the vast resources of the fallen empires. She had something else, something that the galaxy had dismissed as a weakness for 100 years. She had the stubbornness to try anyway. And far away on the other side of the galaxy, in a place no living species knew existed, something ancient and patient watched the small blue world with great interest. It had seen this test play out 1,000 times before. It had watched civilizations fall and never rise. It had watched the strong devour the weak and then devour themselves. But it had never seen this. It had never seen a species so small and so young look at the darkness and say, no. It watched, and for the first time in 100,000 years, it wondered what would happen next. 72 hours after the Nexus died, Captain Duran Mwangi stood on the bridge of the EFS Perseverance and looked out at the stars. The ship was old. It was one of Earth's heavy cargo haulers, originally built to move grain and building supplies between human colonies. It was not fast. It was not beautiful. Its hull was scratched and dented from years of honest work, and the engine made a low groaning sound that the engineering crew had given up trying to fix. They just called it the old man's cough and moved on. Now, the Perseverance was part of the first emergency fleet Earth had ever sent beyond its own borders. 12 ships in total, carrying food, water, medicine, generators, and 300 human volunteers who had signed up within hours of the call going out. They were heading for the Valith homeworld of Ocean, one of the oldest and most prestigious civilizations in the galaxy. The Valith had once ruled an empire that stretched across 200 star systems. They were tall, graceful beings with silver skin and 4 arms. They lived for 500 years. They had mastered technologies that humans could barely understand. They had built monuments that floated in the upper atmosphere of gas giants. They had composed music that could make other species weep with its beauty. And now they were starving. Nidaran read the briefing report for the 3rd time. Without the Nexus, the Valith food production system had completely collapsed. It turned out that the Valith had not actually grown their own food in over 8,000 years. The Nexus had managed everything: the automated farms, the processing plants, the distribution networks. The Valith themselves had forgotten how agriculture worked. Not just the details, the concept. They had an entire generation of beings who did not understand where food came from. "How does a civilization forget how to feed itself?" asked Lieutenant Priya Sharma, the ship's medical officer, reading the same report over Duran's shoulder. "The same way a person forgets how to walk if they spend their whole life in a wheelchair," Duran said. "You do not lose the ability all at once. You lose it slowly, in one small piece at a time, until one day you look down and realize you cannot remember how your legs work." Priya was quiet for a moment. "That is terrifying." "Yes," Duran agreed. "It is." Back on Earth, the debate that Ambassador Okafor Singh had predicted was already raging. The United Nations Stellar Council had been in emergency session for 2 days straight, and the arguments had only grown louder. Secretary General Thomas Herrera stood at the center of it. He was a tall man with gray hair and kind eyes that could turn hard as stone when he needed them to. He had grown up in a small town in Colombia where his mother ran a clinic with whatever supplies she could find. He understood scarcity. He understood the impulse to hoard when times were hard, and he understood why it was wrong. "We have a responsibility," he said to the council. "The galaxy is in crisis. We have the ability to help. Therefore, we must help." Admiral Yuki Tanaka stood on the other side of the chamber. She was a decorated officer with 30 years of service. She had defended human colonies against pirate raids. She had navigated political minefields with the same precision she used to navigate asteroid fields. And she was not convinced. "With respect, Secretary General, responsibility to whom? To the species that spent a century laughing at us? To the Valith, who blocked our application for full council membership 3 times? To the Shokun, who publicly called humanity a waste of carbon?" She paused to let the words settle. "We have 8 billion people on Earth and another 2 billion in our colonies. If we send our food reserves out into the galaxy, and what happens when our people go hungry?" The chamber was divided. On one side, those who agreed with Herrera argued that this was not just a moral choice, but a strategic one. If humanity helped rebuild the galaxy, it would earn a position of respect that centuries of diplomacy had failed to achieve. On the other side, Tanaka's supporters pointed out that Earth's resources were limited. The galaxy was vast, and there were 4,000 civilizations out there, all collapsing at the same time. Even if Earth gave everything it had, it would not be enough. There was also a third voice in the debate, quieter than the others but growing stronger every day. It came from people who looked at the situation and saw not a crisis, but an opportunity. The galaxy was on its knees. Earth was the only power still standing. Why not take advantage? And why not build a human empire while the competition was too weak to resist? This voice did not have a single leader. It lived in whispered conversations in hallways, in opinion articles that carefully avoided saying the word empire while describing exactly that. It was the shadow in the corner of every debate, the thought that many people had but few were willing to say out loud. Herrera heard it, and it frightened him more than anything else. "We are not conquerors," he said, his voice carrying through the chamber with a weight that silenced the room. "That is not who we are. That is not who we will become. We help because it is right. We help because we can. And we help because one day, when we are the ones in trouble, we want to live in a galaxy that helps." The vote was close, closer than it should have been. But in the end, the council approved the relief missions. Earth would send food, medicine, and technical support to any world that asked for it. The cost would be enormous. The risk would be real. But the decision was made, and so the ships went out. The Perseverance arrived at Ocean on the 5th day. Duran had seen pictures of the Valeth homeworld before. In those pictures, it had been stunning. A world of crystal towers and floating gardens, of cities that rose from the ground like frozen music. The Valeth were artists as much as they were engineers, and their world reflected that in every detail. What Duran saw through the viewport now was different. The floating gardens had fallen. Without the nexus to maintain the anti-gravity systems, they had crashed to the surface, leaving vast scars across the landscape. The crystal towers were dark. The cities were silent, and on the landing pad where the Perseverance set down, a crowd of Valeth stood waiting. Duran had expected many things. He had expected hostility, perhaps, or cold dignity. The Valeth were a proud species, and accepting help from humanity, the youngest, loudest, most chaotic species in the conquered, would not come easily. What he did not expect was the look in their eyes. He had seen that look before. He had grown up in Nairobi, and when he was 7 years old, a massive flood had destroyed his neighborhood. He remembered standing in the ruins of his family's home, holding his little sister's hand, waiting for the rescue teams to arrive. He remembered the way his mother looked when she finally saw the helicopters coming. Not relieved, not grateful, but something else. Something raw. The look of a person who had been strong for as long as they could and had finally reached the end of their strength. That was the look on the Valeth faces. He walked down the loading ramp and was met by a Valeth official named Saron Vel. Saron was tall even by Valeth standards, with silver skin that had gone dull with stress, and 4 arms that hung at his sides as if they had forgotten their purpose. "Captain Mwangi," Saron said. His voice was flat. His translator device, one of the few that still worked, running on a human-made battery, rendered his words in careful English. "We are grateful for your arrival." It was the hardest sentence Duran had ever heard anyone say. "We are glad to be here," Duran replied. He kept his voice steady and warm. No pity, no superiority, just one person talking to another. "We brought food, clean water, medical supplies, portable generators, and a team of agricultural engineers." Saron's eyes flickered at that last item. "Agricultural engineers?" "Yes, people who know how to grow food." There was a silence. Saron looked at the human ship, this battered, ugly, groaning thing, and then looked at the ruins of his world, the towers that had once touched the clouds, the gardens that had once floated in the sky, the civilization that had been old when humanity was still learning to make fire. "We have not grown food ourselves in 8,000 years, Saron said quietly. "I know," Duran said. "That is why we are here." The first days on Ocean were difficult. The Valeth were cooperative, but deeply uncomfortable. Having humans, these short-lived, rough-skinned, noisy creatures, walking through their ancient cities felt wrong to them on a level they could not easily express. It was as if a child had been invited into a museum to fix the paintings. The child might be helpful, but that did not make the situation any less humiliating. Duran understood this. He had been briefed on Valeth psychology, and he had also dealt with pride before. His grandmother had been a fiercely independent woman who had refused all help after his grandfather died, even when she could barely walk. Darn had learned that the trick was not to offer help as charity, it was to offer it as partnership. So instead of telling the Valeth what to do, he asked them to teach him about their world. What was the soil like? What was the climate cycle? What plants had once grown here before the Nexus took over? And the Valeth did not know the answers. Not anymore. But the questions made them curious. And curiosity, Duran had found, was more powerful than pride. The human agricultural engineers set up a small test field outside the main city. They used hand tools and simple irrigation. technology that would have been recognizable to a farmer from ancient Mesopotamia. The Valith watched with a mixture of fascination and horror. A species that had manipulated the quantum structure of matter for thousands of years was now watching humans push seeds into dirt with their fingers. "Is this truly how your species produces food?" asked a young Valith named Kale, who had been assigned to assist the human team. She had never seen a plant growing outside of a decorative display. "One of the ways, yes," said Maria Santos, the lead agricultural engineer. She was a short, sunburned woman from Brazil with dirt permanently under her fingernails and a smile that could light up a dark room. "We have more advanced methods too, but the advanced methods need infrastructure, and right now you do not have infrastructure, so we start with this." "With dirt," Kyle said. She did not say it with contempt. She said it with something closer to wonder. "With dirt," Maria confirmed. "Everything starts with dirt." While the relief efforts were underway on the surface, something else was happening in the space around Ocean. A team of human engineers, led by a woman named Specialist Chen Wei, had been sent to examine the remains of a Nexus relay station that floated in orbit. The station had been one of thousands scattered across the galaxy. Massive structures that served as nodes in the Nexus network. When the Nexus shut down, most of these stations had destroyed themselves. But this one, for reasons no one understood, had merely gone dormant. Chen Wei and her team docked with the station and spent 3 days exploring it. What they found inside was deeply unsettling. The station's systems were dead, but its memory banks were partially intact. Chen Wei was a specialist in alien technology, one of the few humans who had studied Nexus architecture. She had always been told that the Nexus was a tool, a very advanced, very old tool, but still just a tool. Something that the ancient species had built to serve them. What she found in the memory banks told a different story. The shutdown had not been a malfunction. It had not been an attack. And the Nexus had executed a protocol, a set of instructions buried so deep in its architecture that no living species even knew they existed. The protocol had a name, written in a language that predated every known civilization in the galaxy. Chen Wei's translation software struggled with it, but eventually produced a rough equivalent, the Crucible. She found records showing that this was not the first time the protocol had been triggered. It had happened before, many times, at regular intervals stretching back further than the age of most stars. Every time the same thing happened. The Nexus would support a galactic civilization for roughly 100,000 years, long enough for every species in the galaxy to become completely dependent on it, and then it would shut down, deliberately, completely, and the civilization would collapse. And every time the result was the same: total destruction, no recovery. Chen Wei stared at the data for a long time. Then she contacted Captain Wangi. "Captain," she said, her voice carefully controlled, "the Nexus did not break. It was designed to do this. Someone built it to collapse on purpose. And whoever they are, they have been doing it for millions of years." Duran received this information sitting in his quarters aboard the Perseverance. He read Chen Wei's report twice. He looked at the data. He looked at the translation of the ancient word, the Crucible, and felt a chill that had nothing to do with the ship's climate control. Someone had built the Nexus not as a gift to the galaxy, but as a trap, a test, and every civilization that had ever taken the test had failed. He forwarded the report to Earth with a single note: "We need to understand what this means, and we need to understand it fast." But even as the mystery deepened, life on Oashin continued. The seeds Maria planted began to sprout, small green shoots pushing up through alien soil. The Valith gathered to watch them grow, and Darren saw something in their faces that he had not seen before. Hope, fragile, uncertain, barely alive. But there, Kale knelt beside the seedlings and reached out with one of her 4 hands to touch a tiny leaf. She was very gentle, as if she was afraid it would break. "It grows," she said softly. "From nothing, it grows." "Not from nothing," Maria said. She knelt beside Kyle and put her hand on the dirt. "From this, from water, from light, from patience. That is all you need." "We did not know," Kyle said, and her voice cracked. "We forgot." Maria put her rough, sunburned hand on Kale's silver arm. "That is okay," she said. "You remember now." And far away across the ruined galaxy, on 1,000 other worlds, similar scenes were playing out. Human ships arriving at alien ports. Human hands offering food to beings that towered over them. Human voices explaining simple things. How to purify water, how to build a shelter, how to start a fire, to species that had once pitied them for knowing such primitive skills. It was not enough. It was never going to be enough. The galaxy was too big and too broken, and humanity was too small. But it was a start. And then, on the 7th day after the Nexus fell, Ambassador Okafor Singh received a transmission that changed everything. It came from deep space, not from any known world, but from the galactic core, a region that no living species had ever explored. The signal was faint and fractured, and it took the technicians on Hearthlight hours to clean it up enough to read. When they did, Lena felt the blood drain from her face. The message was written in the same ancient language that Chen Wei had found in the Nexus relay. The language that predated every known civilization. The technicians ran it through every translation algorithm they had. Most produced garbage, but one, designed by a human linguist who specialized in dead languages, produced a result. 3 words. The test has begun. Lena stood alone in the operations center and read those words again and again. The test has begun, not a test. The test. As if there had only ever been one. Aaron, as if every civilization that had ever existed in the galaxy had been building toward this single moment. She thought about the Nexus, about how it had been designed to create dependence, about how it had been designed to collapse, about how every previous civilization had fallen and never risen again. And she thought about humanity, about the candles next to the fusion reactor, about the species that had refused to surrender its ability to struggle, about the stubborn, messy, chaotic little world that had never stopped doing things the hard way. Maybe that was the point. Maybe the hard way was the whole point. She sent the message to Earth and to every human ship in the galaxy with a single addition: the test has begun, and we are not going to fail. 3 weeks after the Nexus fell, the galaxy looked like a body that had lost its blood. The structures were still there. The worlds, the stations, the cities, the ships. But the life that had flowed through them was gone. And in the emptiness, terrible things began to grow. Dr. Amina Yusuf arrived on the Drymarry world of Veth Shal aboard a small medical transport ship. She was a xenopsychologist, one of the few humans who had spent her career studying how alien minds worked. She was 43 years old, tall and thin, with dark eyes that noticed everything, and a quiet voice that somehow carried more weight than shouting. She had spent the last decade studying the Drymarry from a distance, writing papers about their hive mind consciousness that were respected in academic circles and ignored by everyone else. Now everyone needed her. The Drymarry were a species of roughly 9 billion individuals across 12 worlds. But the word individuals had not really applied to them for thousands of years. The Drymarry had evolved a natural telepathic ability, a weak one, originally, good for short distances and simple feelings. But over the centuries, they had amplified it with technology, and when the Nexus came along, they had merged their telepathic network into the Nexus itself. The result was a hive mind of extraordinary power and beauty. 9 billion minds thinking together, dreaming together, creating together. When the Nexus died, that connection was severed in an instant. 9 billion minds that had been one were suddenly 9 billion separate, isolated, terrified individuals. Most of them had never had a private thought in their entire lives. And they did not know how to think alone. They did not know who they were outside the collective. The result was mass psychosis on a scale that no species had ever witnessed. Amina's shuttle landed at the edge of Veth Shal's largest city. The city was beautiful, or it had been. The Drymarry built their cities in spirals, with buildings that curved like seashells and streets that flowed like rivers. Everything was designed to be experienced collectively, every angle calculated to create harmonious thoughts in the shared mind. Now the streets were filled with Drymarry sitting on the ground, rocking back and forth, whispering to themselves. Some of them were screaming, some were completely silent, staring at nothing. Some had curled into tight balls and stopped moving entirely. Amina stepped off the shuttle and was met by a Drymarry named Oren. He was one of the few who was still functional, barely. His hands were shaking, his eyes were wide and unfocused. He spoke in short, broken sentences, as if each word cost him enormous effort. "You are the human doctor," he said. "I am," Amina replied gently. "I am here to help." Oren looked at her with an expression she recognized. It was the expression of someone drowning who sees a hand reaching toward them but does not believe it is real. "We are broken," he said. "We hear nothing. We are alone." "I know," Amina said. "Can you take me to the worst cases?" He led her into the city. What she saw there would stay with her for the rest of her life. The Draimari were not just confused or frightened when they were experiencing something that had no equivalent in human psychology. Imagine spending your entire life as part of an ocean, every drop connected to every other drop, flowing together, feeling together. And then one morning you wake up and you are a single drop of water, falling through empty air with no ocean in sight. That was what 9 billion Draimari were going through, all at once. Some had become violent, lashing out at anyone who came close, unable to process the sensation of being touched by someone whose thoughts they could not feel. Others had gone in the opposite direction, clinging to each other desperately, pressing their bodies together as if physical contact could replace the mental connection they had lost. Some had simply stopped functioning. Their minds had shut down, overwhelmed by the sudden flood of individual consciousness. Amina set up a field station in what had been a community meditation hall. She gathered her small team of human psychologists and began working. She had no protocol for this. No textbook covered treating mass psychological collapse in a formerly telepathic species. She had to build her approach from scratch, drawing on everything she knew about human trauma, grief, and recovery. And that, she realized, was the key. Because humans knew about trauma. Humans were experts in trauma. It was, in some terrible way, humanity's oldest skill. She started with the basics. She taught the functional Draimari how to breathe, not the collective synchronized breathing they had practiced as a hive mind, but individual breathing. Slow, deliberate, one breath at a time. She taught them grounding techniques, how to focus on the physical sensations of their own bodies, their own feet on the ground, their own hands in front of their faces. She taught them that the voice inside their head was their own, and that it was not an enemy. "You are not broken," she told Oren, sitting with him in the quiet of the meditation hall while chaos churned outside. "You are learning something new. You are learning to be yourself." "I do not want to be myself," Oren said. "I want to be us." "I understand," Amina said. "And maybe one day you will find a way back to that. But right now you need to learn to be you first. That is where everything begins." He looked at her with his large dark eyes. "Have you always been alone? In your mind?" "Yes," Amina said. "Every human has, since the beginning." "How do you bear it?" Amina thought about that question for a long time. She thought about her childhood in Mogadishu. She thought about her father, who had survived a war and a famine and had still found the energy to sing songs to his children every night. She thought about her mother, who had worked 16-hour days in a hospital with not enough medicine and had never once stopped smiling at her patients. "We bear it because we choose to," she said. "Every single day we choose to keep going. It is not easy. It was never meant to be easy. But we do it because the alternative is giving up, and humans are very bad at giving up." Oren considered this. "Your species is strange," he said. "Yeah," Amina agreed. "We really are." While Amina worked on Veth Shal, the rest of the galaxy continued to unravel. The Shokun Empire had shattered into 47 separate factions within the first 2 weeks. The Shokun were a warrior species, disciplined and hierarchical, and without the nexus to maintain their chain of command, every regional commander had declared independence. Some of them were trying to hold their territories together. Others were trying to take territory from their neighbors. The first shots had already been fired. In the outer systems, piracy had exploded. Ships that had once traveled safely under Nexus protection were now prey for anyone with a weapon and a lack of conscience. Trade convoys that carried food and supplies between worlds were being raided. Some worlds, already hungry, were becoming desperate. And in the dark spaces between the stars, some species had simply stopped trying. The Kelorn, a peaceful species of artists who had lived for centuries in orbital habitats, maintained entirely by the Nexus, had lost everything when their habitat's life support systems failed. By the time human ships reached them, two of their three habitats were dead. The survivors were found drifting in the cold, their beautiful artwork floating around them like snow. Earth's resources were being stretched to the breaking point. Secretary General Herrera had authorized the conversion of nearly a third of Earth's commercial fleet into relief ships. Food reserves were being drawn down at a rate that made the logistics officers nervous. Human volunteers were scattered across hundreds of worlds, working themselves to exhaustion. Some of them had died, killed in riots or in accidents, or simply from the strain of trying to do too much with too little. Admiral Tanaka, to her credit, did not say, "I told you so." She simply submitted a revised budget request and recommended doubling the number of ships equipped with defensive weapons. The galaxy, she noted in her report, was becoming a dangerous place. But even as the galaxy burned, something remarkable was beginning to happen. On every world where humans had arrived, something was changing. Not the physical situation. That was still dire. What was changing was something harder to measure, but far more important. The alien species were beginning to learn. On Oashan, the Valith were growing food. Not much. Not well. The first harvest was tiny and uneven, and a Valith farmer would have made any human agricultural student cringe. But they were doing it, egg with their own hands, for the first time in 8,000 years. On Veth Shal, Orn had begun to teach other Draimari the breathing techniques Amina had shown him. He was not a doctor. He was not a therapist. He was a former musician who had played instruments designed for a hive mind orchestra. But he learned the techniques, and he passed them on, and the circle of functional Draimari slowly grew. On the Shokun border worlds, a human negotiator named James Achebe had managed to convince three warring factions to stop shooting at each other long enough to share a meal. It was not peace. It was barely even a ceasefire. But it was something, and something was better than nothing. The elder Valith scholar, Saron Vel, the same official who had greeted Duran at the landing pad with those painful words of gratitude, had begun to study human history. He had requested access to Earth's historical archives, and the humans had given it freely. He spent days reading about human wars, famines, plagues, and collapses. He read about the fall of Rome. He read about the Black Death. He read about the 2 world wars. He read about climate change and the decades of crisis that followed. He read about every terrible thing that had ever happened to humanity. And then he read about what came after: the rebuilding, the recovery, the stubborn, relentless, sometimes irrational refusal to accept that things could not get better. He gathered a meeting of Valith leaders, what was left of them, and delivered a speech that would become famous across the galaxy. Not because it was elegant or poetic, though Saron was capable of both, but because it was honest in a way that the Valith had not been honest with themselves in a very long time. "We pitied them," he said, standing in a hall that had once glowed with Nexus light and now was lit by human-made lanterns. "When they first came to the Concord, we looked at them and we pitied them. They were so young, so small, so fragile. They broke so easily. They died so quickly. They fought with each other over things that seemed meaningless. And we thought, these creatures have nothing to teach us." He paused and looked at the faces around him. Proud faces. Ancient faces. Faces that had spent centuries believing they were among the greatest beings the galaxy had ever produced. "We were wrong," he said. "We were so deeply, completely, terribly wrong." He held up a human device, a simple tablet loaded with human historical records. "I have spent the past 2 weeks reading the history of this small species, and what I found there has shaken me more than the fall of the Nexus. Because their history is a history of breaking. They break over and over and over again. They break in ways that would destroy any other species. Wars that kill millions. Diseases that wipe out continents. Disasters that reshape their world. They have experienced more suffering in their short existence than we have experienced in our long one." His voice grew quiet. "And yet they are still here. Every time they break, they rebuild. Or every time they fall, they stand up. Not because they are strong. They are not strong, not in the way we understand strength, but because they have something we do not have, something we gave up long ago when we handed our future to the Nexus. He set the tablet down. They remember how to struggle. They never forgot. And that is why, when the galaxy fell overnight, they were the only ones left standing, not because they were prepared for this specifically, but because they have been preparing for disaster their entire existence. Every flood, every famine, every war, it was all training. They did not know it at the time, but their history made them into the only species in the galaxy that knows how to survive when everything falls apart. He looked at his people. We called them the species that keeps candles next to the fusion reactor. We said it as an insult, but the fusion reactor is dead, and the candles are the only light left in the galaxy. We need to learn from them. We need to learn how to struggle again. We need to learn how to break and rebuild, because that is what survival looks like. Not perfection, not control, not the elegant systems we built and worshipped. Survival looks like dirt under your fingernails and seeds in the ground and the stubborn refusal to lie down and die. The room was silent when he finished. Then slowly the Valeth began to move. Not with their usual grace, clumsily, awkwardly, like children learning to walk. They moved toward the fields where the human engineers were working, and they knelt in the dirt, and they began to learn. And far away at the heart of the galaxy, so Chen Wei's discovery was about to lead to something even more extraordinary. The human deep space exploration team, following the signal that Lena had received, had been traveling toward the galactic core for 2 weeks. Their ship, the EFS Discovery, was the fastest in Earth's fleet, which meant it was still painfully slow by galactic standards. But it moved, and that was what mattered. They found the source of the signal at the edge of a region of space that no map had ever charted. There was a structure there, not a station, not a planet, but something in between. It hung in space like a jewel the size of a moon, dark and silent, radiating a faint energy signature that pulsed like a heartbeat. The Discovery approached carefully. Captain Elena Vasquez, the mission commander, was not the kind of person who took unnecessary risks. She ordered full scans, checked weapon systems, and prepared for every possible scenario. She was not prepared for what actually happened. A door opened in the side of the structure, not a mechanical door, something more organic, as if the structure itself had parted its skin to let them in. And through the opening, a light appeared. Warm, golden, and unmistakably an invitation. Vasquez looked at her crew. Her crew looked back at her. "Well," she said, "we did not come all this way to stare at the door." They entered. Inside they found beings, not machines, not holograms, living, breathing beings that were unlike anything humanity had ever encountered. They were tall and luminous, their bodies seeming to shift between solid and light. Their eyes were old, not just aged, but old in the way that mountains are old, in the way that rivers are old. They looked at the human team with an expression that took Vasquez a long time to identify. Surprise. "You should not be here," one of them said. Its voice was calm and deep, resonating not just through the air, but through the structure itself. No species has ever reached this place after a crucible event. No species has ever still been organized enough to send an exploration mission. Vasquez straightened her shoulders. "We are full of surprises." The beings regarded her. Then slowly one of them made a gesture that might have been a smile. "Yes," it said, "we are beginning to understand that." They called themselves the Architects, and they had been watching the galaxy for a very long time. They confirmed what Chen Wei had suspected. The Nexus was their creation. The Crucible was their design. For every 100,000 years, the Nexus would support a galactic civilization until that civilization became completely dependent, and then the Nexus would shut down. The Architects called it pruning, a test to see if any species in the galaxy had maintained the ability to survive without the system they had come to depend on. "Every previous civilization failed," the Architect said. "The pattern is always the same. Dependence grows, independence dies. And when the support is removed, the civilization collapses. We have watched this cycle repeat for longer than your species has existed." Why? Vasquez asked. Why build something designed to destroy? The architect was quiet for a moment. Because a galaxy of dependent species is a galaxy waiting to die. Not from us, from anything. A single disaster, a single failure, and everything ends. Watch, we built the crucible to find species that are different. Species that maintain their ability to survive independently. Species that could lead the galaxy into genuine resilience rather than comfortable dependence. And has any species ever passed? The silence that followed was the loudest thing Vasquez had ever heard. No, the architect said. Until now, no species has ever still been standing after the crucible began. It looked at Vasquez and her crew, these small, fragile, impossibly stubborn beings who had traveled across the galaxy in a battered ship to knock on a door that no one was supposed to find. And in its ancient eyes, Vasquez saw something she had never expected to see directed at humanity. Fear. You are not what we expected, the architect said quietly. You are something new. Why? And we do not yet know what that means. Vasquez smiled. It was not a polite smile. It was the smile of a species that had spent its entire history being underestimated. It means, she said, that we are just getting started. 6 weeks after the Nexus fell, the galaxy began to stabilize. Not because things were getting better. In many places, they were still getting worse. But because the initial shock had passed. The screaming had stopped. The chaos had settled into something more dangerous. A grinding, exhausting struggle for survival that tested every world in ways they had never been tested before. And at the center of it all, like a heart pumping blood through a damaged body, was Earth. The Lighthouse Initiative, as Herrera had named it, had grown far beyond its original scope. What had started as a handful of emergency relief missions had become a galaxy-spanning network of human-run stations that provided food, medicine, communication, and technical support to hundreds of worlds. Human ships moved constantly between systems, carrying supplies and specialists. Human engineers repaired broken infrastructure. Human doctors treated alien injuries. Human farmers taught alien species how to feed themselves. Human negotiators mediated disputes between factions that were ready to go to war. It was messy. It was exhausting. It was held together with determination and not much else. And it was working. But it was also creating something that Ambassador Lena Okafor-Singh had feared from the very beginning. Dependency. She saw it in the way alien leaders spoke to her now. The Vileth, Sorso, who had once barely acknowledged humanity's existence, now sent daily requests to Earth for guidance on everything from agricultural policy to urban planning. The Drymery, slowly recovering under Amina's care, had begun to treat human psychologists as essential members of their communities rather than temporary visitors. Even the fractured Shokun factions had started to use human mediators as a permanent feature of their negotiations. The galaxy was not rebuilding itself. It was rebuilding itself around Earth. And that was exactly the trap that had destroyed every previous civilization. Lena understood this because she had spent her career studying the Nexus. She had always found it strange that a system so powerful had been accepted so completely by every species in the galaxy. Now she understood why. The Nexus had not forced anyone to depend on it. It had simply been so good, so reliable, so convenient, that giving up independence felt like the obvious choice. Why struggle when someone else can do it for you? Why maintain your own systems when a better system is available? And now humanity was becoming the new Nexus. Not through malice, not through ambition, through kindness, through helpfulness, through the simple, natural human desire to fix things. Every time a human engineer repaired an alien system, every time a human ship delivered food to a hungry world, every time a human diplomat solved a dispute, it was good, it was necessary, it was the right thing to do. And it was also making the galaxy dependent on Earth. She brought her concerns to Secretary General Herrera in a private communication. He listened carefully, his face grave on the screen. "You are right," he said. "I have been thinking the same thing. But what do we do? Stop helping?" "No," Lena said. "We help differently. We stop doing things for them and start teaching them to do things for themselves. And then we step back." That is going to be a hard sell, Herrera said. People like being needed. I know, Lena said. That is what makes this so dangerous. While Lena and Herrera wrestled with the philosophical problem, the political problem was growing teeth. Admiral Yuki Tanaka had not stopped arguing her position. In fact, the events of the past 6 weeks had, in her view, proven her right. Earth had stretched itself dangerously thin. Resources were being consumed at an unsustainable rate. Human volunteers were burning out, and the galaxy, rather than becoming more self-sufficient, was becoming more dependent on human support. But Tanaka's argument had evolved. She was no longer simply saying that Earth should stop helping. She was saying something more complex and more seductive. We have already taken on the burden, she told the Stellar Council in an emergency session. We cannot put it down now without causing even more harm. Millions of beings depend on our supply lines. If we withdraw support, worlds will starve. Factions will go to war. The Dry Mari recovery will collapse. She paused, letting the logic settle. So the question is not whether we lead. We are already leading. The question is whether we lead well or poorly. And leading well means having a structure, a system, authority. She did not use the word empire. She did not need to. The council chamber was quiet. And in the quiet, Lena could hear the sound of something dangerous being born. Not in the angry voices of extremists. In the reasonable, measured, thoughtful voice of a woman who genuinely believed she was doing the right thing. That was what made it so frightening. Tanaka was not a villain. She was a patriot who saw a problem and proposed a logical solution. And her solution had the terrible advantage of being easy. Taking control was easy. Building an empire was easy, especially when your subjects were begging you to do it. Because that was the other side of the equation. The alien species were not just passively accepting human help. Many of them were actively requesting human governance. The Valeth Council had formally proposed that Earth take a supervisory role in their reconstruction, a polite way of asking humans to make their decisions for them. 3 of the Shokun factions had offered to swear loyalty to Earth in exchange for protection. Even the Dry Mari, through their recovering councils, had suggested that human psychologists be given permanent authority over their mental health systems. The galaxy was not just falling into human hands, it was climbing into them. And on Earth, the public was divided. Polls showed that roughly 40% of humans supported some form of permanent galactic leadership. Another 30% opposed it. The remaining 30% were unsure. The arguments on both sides were passionate. One of those in favor pointed out that humanity had earned this position through sacrifice and service. Those opposed argued that becoming the thing you replaced was the oldest mistake in history. The debate reached its peak on a cold Tuesday morning in the Stellar Council chamber. Herrera had called a full session to decide Earth's long-term strategy. Every council member was present. The gallery was packed with observers, journalists, diplomats, military officers, and civilian representatives. The entire planet was watching. Tanaka spoke first. She was calm, precise, and devastatingly logical. I am not proposing conquest, she said. I am proposing responsibility. The galaxy needs a center. It needs coordination. It needs a single point of stability around which recovery can organize. We did not ask for this role. It was forced on us by circumstance, but to refuse it now would be cowardice disguised as humility. She laid out her plan, a human-led galactic authority that would manage trade routes, coordinate defense, and oversee reconstruction. Each species would maintain internal autonomy, but defer to Earth on interstellar matters. It was not an empire, she insisted. It was a partnership, with humanity as the senior partner. The applause from her supporters was long and loud. Then Lena stood. She had spent the previous night preparing her response. She had written drafts and thrown them away. She had paced her quarters until the floor felt thin. And in the end, she had abandoned her notes and decided to speak from the heart. Admiral Tanaka is right about one thing, she began. The galaxy needs leadership. It needs coordination. It needs stability. She is right that we have earned the trust that has been placed in us, and she is right that walking away now would cause enormous harm. She looked around the chamber. But she is wrong about the solution, and she is wrong for a reason that I think every human, in their gut, already understands. She took a breath. We know what happened to the galaxy. We know about the crucible. We know that every civilization before ours was given the same test, and every one of them failed. And do you know why they failed? Not because they were weak, not because they were stupid. They failed because they replaced one dependency with another. The nexus fell, and they found something else to depend on. A strong species, a powerful leader, an empire that promised to take care of them. And for a while it worked. And then, a few thousand years later, the crucible came again, and they fell again, because they had learned nothing. The chamber was very quiet. If we accept what Tanaka is proposing, we become the new nexus. Not a machine this time, but the effect is the same. The galaxy will organize itself around us. It will depend on us. It will forget again how to survive on its own. And the next time a crisis comes, and a crisis will always come, it will fall again. And this time, it will take us down with it. She stepped forward, closer to the center of the chamber. I did not spend 6 weeks watching alien species learn to plant seeds and breathe on their own and make peace with their neighbors, just so we could make them dependent on us instead of a machine. That is not leadership. That is a cage painted to look like a shelter. She paused. I know what real leadership looks like. I saw it in a Brazilian woman kneeling in the dirt on an alien world, teaching a being 10 times her age how to grow food. I saw it in a Kenyan captain who treated a proud species with dignity instead of pity. I saw it in a Somali doctor who taught a shattered mind how to breathe. That is leadership, not control, not authority, not a seat at the top of a hierarchy. Leadership is teaching someone to stand on their own and then stepping back. She looked directly at Tanaka, not with anger, with respect. Admiral, you are one of the finest officers Earth has ever produced, and your plan would work. For a while, maybe for a long while, but it would end the same way every empire ends, the same way the Nexus ended, and we would have learned nothing, and the galaxy would have learned nothing. And in 100,000 years, some other species would be standing in some other chamber, having this exact same conversation. She turned to face the full council. I propose something harder. I propose that instead of becoming the galaxy's leader, we become its teacher. We share everything we know, our technology, our agriculture, our medicine, our conflict resolution, our history, all of it, freely and without conditions. We help every species build its own independent systems, its own food production, its own communication networks, its own defense, its own government. And then we step back, not because we do not care, but because we care enough to let them struggle. She paused again. I call it the compact of fires. Not one great fire that everyone gathers around. That is what the Nexus was, and that is what an empire would be. 1,000 small fires, each one independent, each one stubborn, each one burning on its own fuel. That is what the galaxy needs. Not another center, not another system to depend on. A galaxy of worlds that can each stand alone and choose to stand together. The silence that followed was enormous. It filled the chamber like water filling a glass, pressing against the walls, pushing up to the ceiling. Then Secretary General Herrera stood. He looked at Tanaka. He looked at Lena. And then he spoke. I grew up in a small town in Colombia, he said. My mother was a doctor. She ran a clinic with almost nothing. And she told me something when I was young that I have never forgotten. She said, Tomas, a good doctor heals people. A great doctor teaches people to heal themselves. He turned to the council. I move that we adopt Ambassador Okafor Singh's proposal, the Compact of Fires, not because it is easy. It is the hardest thing we could possibly do, but because it is right. The vote was held. It was not close. Tanaka's proposal received strong support from the military bloc and some of the industrial representatives. But the rest of the council, moved by Lena's words and Herrera's support, voted for the compact. Tanaka accepted the result with grace. She was a soldier, and soldiers followed orders. But after the vote, she approached Lena in the hallway. You understand what you have done, Tanaka said. It was not a question. I have chosen the harder path. You have chosen to give away our advantage. The galaxy is weak. We are strong. That will not last forever. One day they will not need us anymore. And when that day comes, we will be just another species. No power, no leverage, No empire. Lena looked at her. That is the point, Admiral. That is exactly the point. Tanaka studied her for a long moment. Then something shifted in her expression. Not agreement, something more complicated, something that might, with time, grow into understanding. You are either the wisest person in this building or the most naive, Tanaka said. I genuinely cannot tell which. Neither can I, Lena admitted, but I would rather be naive and right than wise and wrong. Tanaka almost smiled. Almost. Then she turned and walked away, already planning how to build the decentralized defense network that the Compact of Fires would need. Because whatever she thought of the decision, she was going to make sure it worked. That was who she was. The announcement of the Compact of Fires went out across the galaxy within hours. The reaction was mixed. Some species embraced it immediately, recognizing the wisdom of building independent strength. Others were confused or even frightened. They had been hoping that Earth would take control, and the idea of being responsible for themselves was terrifying. But on Oashin, Captain Duran Mwangi received the news and felt something he had not felt in weeks. Relief. He had been overseeing the reconstruction of the Valeth agricultural system, a massive project that had consumed his every waking hour. The Valeth were learning fast. Kale, the young Valeth who had watched the first seeds sprout with wonder, had become one of the most dedicated students in the program. She worked alongside Maria Santos every day, her four hands moving through the soil with increasing confidence, her questions growing sharper and more insightful. But Duran had worried that the learning would stop, that once the crisis stabilized, the Valeth would quietly ask the humans to keep running things, that the partnership would become dependency, the way it always did. The Compact of Fires changed that. It set a date, a timeline, a clear point at which the human teams would hand over control and step back. The Valeth would have to be ready, and that deadline, that pressure, was exactly what they needed. On the day the Compact was announced, Duran gathered the Valeth agricultural team for a meeting. He stood in front of a group of beings who towered over him, beings whose civilization was older than human history, beings who were learning to farm from a species they had once considered barely civilized. The Compact of Fires has been approved, he said. You know what that means. In 6 months, my team goes home. Everything we have built here, the farms, the irrigation systems, the storage facilities, will be yours. Completely yours. We are not going to run it for you. We are not going to monitor it for you. We are going to hand it over, and you are going to take it from there. He looked at their faces. He saw fear. He saw doubt. But underneath it, stubborn and growing, he saw determination. You can do this, he said. I know you can, because I have watched you learn. I have watched you go from not knowing what a seed is to growing your own food in 6 weeks. That is extraordinary. That is strength, not our strength. Wait, yours. Kyle stepped forward. Her silver skin caught the light of the human-made lanterns that still lit the hall. We will be ready, she said, and her voice did not shake. In the weeks that followed, the galaxy began to change. Not quickly, not dramatically, but steadily, like a river finding a new course after a landslide. On world after world, human teams began the slow process of transferring knowledge and control to local populations. It was painful. It was messy. There were setbacks, crops that failed, communication systems that crashed, negotiations that fell apart. Some species struggled badly. Some fell back into chaos and needed human intervention all over again. But the direction was clear. The galaxy was not being rescued. It was being taught to rescue itself. And the architects watched. From their ancient place at the heart of the galaxy, they observed with senses that no other species could comprehend. They had watched the crucible play out countless times before. They had watched species rise to fill the vacuum left by the Nexus. Strong species, clever species, species that built empires and called it salvation. And every time the pattern repeated. Dependency formed around the new center. The new center became the new Nexus. And when the next crucible came, everything fell again. They had expected humanity to follow the same pattern. The logic was simple. Humanity was the strongest surviving species. The galaxy was weak. Strength fills weakness. That was the law of every civilization they had ever observed. But humanity had done something unprecedented. It had looked at the open door to empire and walked in the other direction. Not out of weakness, not out of naivety, out of a clear-eyed understanding that power concentrated is power waiting to fail. The architects conferred among themselves. They had not conferred on a decision in over 10,000 years. There had never been a reason to. The pattern had always played out the same way. "They are teaching," one of them said, as if the concept was difficult to grasp. "They are leaving," another said. "They have the power to stay, and they are choosing to leave. This has never happened before." "No, it has not." They watched, and they waited. Because for the first time in their immeasurably long existence, they did not know what would happen next. And that, perhaps, was the most human thing of all. 5 years. That was how long it took. 5 years of struggle and setback and slow, stubborn progress. 5 years of dirt under fingernails and sleepless nights and arguments that went nowhere, and small victories that meant everything. 5 years since the Nexus died and the galaxy fell, and a little blue planet refused to let the darkness win. The galaxy that emerged from those 5 years was not the galaxy that had existed before. It was rougher, louder, less elegant. The smooth, seamless perfection of the Nexus era was gone, replaced by something that looked, to the untrained eye, like chaos. Communication networks that used 12 different standards because 12 different species had built them independently. Trade routes that zigzagged inefficiently because each sector had designed its own. Ships that looked nothing alike because they had been built by hands that had never built ships before. It was, by every metric the old galaxy would have used, a mess. It was also alive. More alive than the galaxy had been in 100,000 years. Ambassador Lena Okafor Singh stood at the window of the newly built compact hall on the station that had once been called Hearthlight. The station had been rebuilt, not restored to its former glory, but rebuilt into something new. The old Concord chamber, with its perfect symmetry and its 1,000 screens, was gone. In its place was a hall that was deliberately, almost stubbornly imperfect. The walls were made of materials donated by different species. Valith crystal next to Shakun metal, next to human concrete, next to dry Murray Livingstone. No two sections matched, and the lighting was uneven. The acoustics were terrible. It was the most beautiful room Lena had ever seen. Today was the first full session of the Compact of Fires. Representatives from over 300 species had gathered. Not the 4,000 of the old Concord, because many civilizations were still rebuilding and could not spare delegates. But 300 was a start. 300 was extraordinary, considering that 5 years ago, most of these species could not feed themselves. Lena looked out at the gathering and felt a complicated mixture of pride and exhaustion. She was 57 years old now. The last 5 years had aged her in ways that the previous 40 had not. Her hair was streaked with gray. Her hands shook sometimes when she was tired, which was most of the time. She had spent 5 years carrying a weight that no human had ever carried before, and it showed, but she was still standing. That was the important thing. The session opened with a ceremony that had been proposed by the Valith, a species that, 5 years ago, could not have organized a ceremony without human help. Now they managed it themselves, with only a few small mistakes that no one mentioned. A young Valith named Kale lit a flame at the center of the hall. Not a holographic flame, not an energy projection, a real flame, burning real fuel, giving off real heat. The Valith had learned about fire from humans. They had never needed it before. Now they considered it sacred. "One flame," Kyle said, her voice carrying through the imperfect acoustics of the imperfect hall. "One flame to begin, but before this session ends, every delegation will light their own. Not from this one. From fuel they brought themselves, because that is what the compact means. We do not share a fire. We each carry our own." The delegations murmured their approval. Some of them had already begun unpacking the materials they had brought. Tiny torches, chemical lanterns, bioluminescent orbs, and a dozen other light sources, each one different, each one reflecting the species that had made it. Lena watched and felt her throat tighten. She remembered the early days, the desperate messages flooding her communicator, the empty Concord chamber, the terrible weight of being the only light in the galaxy. She remembered thinking that it was too much, that humanity was too small, that the darkness was too vast. She had been wrong. Why not about the darkness? The darkness had been exactly as vast as she feared. She had been wrong about humanity being too small. It turned out that small did not mean weak. It turned out that a single candle, held steady, could show others where to find their own. The session proceeded through its agenda. Trade agreements were negotiated, messy, complicated agreements between species that were still learning to deal with each other without a central system managing everything. Defense protocols were discussed. The decentralized network that Admiral Tanaka had spent the past 4 years building, a system where every species maintained its own military but could call on others for mutual aid. Agricultural reports were shared, and Lena was quietly amazed at the numbers. In most species that had been on the verge of starvation 5 years ago were now feeding themselves. Not well in some cases, not efficiently, but independently. The galaxy was learning to stand on its own feet, and it was doing so in the most wonderfully chaotic way possible. During a break in the session, Lena walked through the corridors of the station and found herself passing a window that looked out into space. She stopped and stared. The view was different from what she remembered. 5 years ago, the space around Hearthlight had been dark. The navigation beacons dead, the communication relays silent, the trade ships frozen in place. Now the space was busy. Ships of every shape and size moved along routes that were new and then still being mapped. Communication satellites blinked with signals that used a dozen different protocols. A Violeth agricultural transport passed close to a Shokun patrol vessel, and neither one fired on the other or needed a central authority to tell them not to. They simply passed each other, one species going about its business, while another species went about its own. It was not elegant, it was not efficient, it was alive. Lena was still at the window when a familiar voice spoke behind her. "You look tired." She turned and saw Darren Mwangi. He was not in uniform anymore. He had retired from active service 2 years ago, after overseeing the final handoff of the Violeth agricultural system. He wore civilian clothes now, and his face had the weathered look of someone who had spent a lot of time outdoors, which he had. He lived on Oashen now, running a joint human Violeth farming school. The school had started with 12 students, and it now had over 1,000. "I am tired," Lena admitted, "but the good kind of tired, the kind where you know you earned it." Duran smiled. "I know that kind. How is the school?" "Growing, literally. We harvested our biggest crop last season. Kyle, you remember Kyle? She is now our head instructor. She is a better farmer than most of my human graduates." Lena shook her head in wonder. The same Kyle who did not know what a seed was 5 years ago. The same one. She told me something last month that I have not been able to stop thinking about. She said that learning to grow food changed the way her species thinks about time. Before, the Violeth planned in terms of centuries and millennia. Everything was long-term, abstract, distant. But farming forced them to think in terms of seasons, weeks, days, the time between planting and harvest. She said it made everything feel more real, more present, more alive. That is beautiful. It is, and it is terrifying for them. Feeling time pass, feeling the urgency of each season, it is new. But Kale says it is also a gift. She says the Violeth spent so long thinking about forever that they forgot to think about today. And today is where the food grows. They stood together at the window for a while, watching the ships pass. "I heard from Amina," Duran said. "Have you read her book?" Lena had. The book was called Broken and Rebuilding, a Universal Theory of Resilience, and it had become the most translated text in galactic history. Dr. Amina Yusuf had written it over the course of 3 years, drawing on her experiences with the Draimari and her deep study of how different species, including humans, processed and recovered from trauma. The central argument of the book was simple and powerful. Resilience was not a trait that some species had and others did not. It was a skill, a practice, a muscle that grew stronger with use. The Draimari had lost their resilience because they had not needed it for thousands of years. Humanity had kept its resilience because it had never stopped needing it. But the important part, The part that had made the book so widely read was Amina's conclusion. Resilience could be learned. Any species at any stage of its development could develop the ability to break and rebuild. It was not a human monopoly. It was a universal capacity that simply needed to be exercised. And the book had given the galaxy something it desperately needed: hope that was grounded in evidence rather than wishful thinking. The Drymaree are using it as the basis for their new educational system, Darren said. Every Drymaree child now learns about individual resilience alongside collective consciousness. They are rebuilding their telepathic network, but slowly, carefully, and they are making sure that every individual can function alone before they join the collective. Amina must be pleased. She is, though she would never say so. You know how she is. Lena did. Amina Yusuf was the kind of person who did extraordinary things and then looked mildly confused when anyone made a fuss about it. The afternoon session brought the moment Lena had been both anticipating and dreading: the election of the Compact's first chairperson. She had known for months that she would be nominated. She had also known for months what she would do about it. But knowing something and doing it were very different things, and when the vote was held and her name was announced, she felt a wave of emotion that nearly knocked her off her feet. She stood before the assembly, 300 species, each one represented by beings who had fought and struggled and suffered and survived to be here today, and accepted the position with a brief speech. "I am honored beyond words," she said, "and I accept this responsibility with one condition. This position will rotate between species every 5 years. I will serve my term, and then I will step down, and someone from another world will take this chair. Not because I want to leave, but because the Compact of Fires is not about any one species leading. It is about every species having the chance to lead." The assembly voted to accept the condition. It was unanimous. Tanaka was in the gallery. She had been invited as a guest, the architect of the Compact's defense network, a system that was now considered one of the most innovative military structures in galactic history. It was entirely decentralized. No single command, no central fleet. Instead, every species maintained its own defense forces and contributed to a mutual aid framework that could be activated by any member in times of crisis. It was the military equivalent of the Compact itself, 1,000 small forces that could act together without depending on each other. After the session, Tanaka approached Lena for the second time in 5 years. "Ash, you did it," Tanaka said. "We did it," Lena corrected. Tanaka made a face. "I argued against it. I fought you every step of the way. And then you built the defense network that made it possible. Without your work, the Compact would have been destroyed by the first pirate fleet that came along." Tanaka was quiet for a moment. "I still think an empire would have been more efficient." "You are probably right. But efficiency is not the point, is it?" "No," Lena said softly. "It is not." Tanaka nodded. She did not say anything else. She did not need to. The two women had spent 5 years on opposite sides of the most important debate in human history, and they had both been changed by it. Tanaka had learned that strength did not require control. Lena had learned that idealism without steel was just a dream. Together, they had built something that neither could have built alone. The final address of the session was given by Secretary General Herrera. He was older now, his hair fully white, his face lined with the weight of the decisions he had made. But his eyes were still kind, and his voice still carried the warmth of the small-town doctor's son, who believed that helping others was not just a duty, but a privilege. He stood at the center of the imperfect hall, surrounded by the light of 300 different flames, and spoke. 5 years ago, the galaxy fell overnight. The systems that held it together vanished, and 4,000 civilizations found themselves alone in the dark. Many of you were afraid. Many of you were desperate. And many of you looked to a small, young, stubborn species on an unremarkable planet and asked for help. He paused. As we gave it, not because we were the best, not because we were the brightest, not because we had some special quality that made us superior to any of you. We gave it because that is what you do when someone falls down. You reach out your hand. He looked around the hall at the faces of beings he had spent 5 years getting to know. Their hopes, their fears, their extraordinary courage in the face of unimaginable loss. But the help we gave was not the important part. The important part was what came after. The important part was watching each of you learn to stand on your own, watching the Valeth grow their first harvest, watching the Draimari rebuild their minds, watching the Shokun choose peace when war would have been easier, watching species that had been dependent for millennia rediscover their own strength. His voice grew quieter but somehow carried further. We were never the hero of this story. We were the match. You are the fire, every single one of you, burning on your own, by your own choice with your own fuel. That is not our achievement. That is yours. And we could not be more proud to stand among you. Not above you, not ahead of you, among you, as one fire among many. He stepped back, and the hall erupted, not with polished applause, with something raw, feet stomping, tentacles slapping, wings beating, voices raised in sounds that meant joy in 100 different languages. It was the sound of a galaxy that had nearly died and had chosen to live. In the compact hall, 300 different lights burned. No two were the same. Some were bright and some were dim. Some flickered and some burned steady. Some gave off heat and some gave off only light. But they all burned, every single one. In the weeks that followed, the galaxy settled into its new rhythm. It was not a smooth rhythm. It stumbled and stuttered and sometimes fell completely off beat. Trade disputes flared up and were resolved badly, and then resolved again slightly less badly. Communication networks crashed and were rebuilt. Old grudges between species surfaced and had to be dealt with through messy, imperfect diplomacy, instead of a machine's perfect mediation. It was, in every possible way, a work in progress, and it was magnificent. Duran Mwangi returned to Oashen in his farming school. He and Saron Vel, the elder Valeth who had given the famous speech about humanity's stubbornness, had become close friends in the way that only two people who have survived something impossible together can be. They sat together in the evenings on the porch of Daran's small house, looking out over fields that had not existed 5 years ago, and talked about everything and nothing. One evening, Saron asked Daran a question that he had been carrying for a long time. Do you believe it will last? This compact? This new way? Daran thought about it. He thought about human history, the empires that had risen and fallen, the civilizations that had flourished and collapsed, the endless cycle of building and breaking that defined his species. No, he said honestly, not forever. Nothing lasts forever. Something will go wrong eventually. There will be a crisis, a war, a disaster, something we cannot predict. Saron looked troubled. Then what was the point? The point, Duran said, leaning back in his chair and looking up at the stars, is that when it goes wrong, you will know how to survive it. You will know how to grow food and build shelters and talk to each other and start over. You will know these things because you learned them, not from the Nexus, not from us. You learned them by doing them yourselves with your own hands. He looked at Saron. That is what the Valeth lost when they gave everything to the Nexus. Not technology, not knowledge. You lost the experience of struggling, and struggle is the only teacher that matters, because struggle is the one thing the universe will never stop giving you. Saron was quiet for a long while. Then he said, your species has a strange relationship with suffering. We do, Duran agreed. We hate it while it is happening, and we are grateful for it when it is over. It is very confusing. Saron made a sound that Duran had learned to recognize as Veleth laughter. You are all absolutely insane. Yes, Duran said, grinning, but it works. And in the hidden place at the heart of the galaxy, the architects convened for the final time. They gathered in their ancient hall, a structure that had existed since before the first star in the galaxy had formed. They were old beyond counting. They had watched life emerge from primordial seas on a million worlds. They had built the Nexus as a tool and a test. They had watched civilizations rise and depend and fall, over and over, for cycles that stretched back to the beginning of time. They had designed the Crucible because they believed that true resilience was the only quality worth measuring. A galaxy of dependent species was a galaxy waiting to die. Only a species, or a galaxy, that could survive the loss of everything it depended on was worthy of continuing. And in every previous cycle, every civilization had failed. Some had failed immediately, collapsing into chaos and extinction. Others had lasted longer, building empires that imitated the Nexus and fell in the next cycle. None had ever done what humanity had done. None had ever chosen to teach instead of rule. None had ever voluntarily given up power in order to make others stronger. None had ever looked at a galaxy full of weakness and seen not subjects to govern, but students to teach and then partners to stand beside. The eldest of the architects spoke. Its voice resonated through the ancient hall with the weight of uncountable years. "Update the record," it said. "The crucible has been administered. The result is unprecedented. The primary surviving species chose dissemination of resilience over concentration of power. Galactic civilization is rebuilding on a distributed, independent model with no central point of failure." It paused. The other architects waited. "The crucible," it said, "has been passed." There was silence, a silence that lasted for what felt like an age. "What do we do now?" asked another architect. It was a question that had never been asked before, because the answer had always been the same. Reset the Nexus, begin the next cycle, wait another 100,000 years. But this time the answer was different. "We watch," said the eldest. "We watch what they build. Not because we expect them to fail, but because for the first time, we genuinely do not know what comes next. And that is something worth seeing." Far away from the galactic core, on a small world in the outer spiral arm of a quiet galaxy, a child looked up at the sky. She was not human. She was Drymari, one of the first generation born after the Nexus fell. She was 7 years old, and she was remarkable in a way that would have been impossible before the collapse. She could think as an individual. She could also join the collective. She could do both, switching between them as easily as a human child switches between playing alone and playing with friends. She was something new, something that had never existed before, an individual who chose to be part of a whole rather than a whole that had never known individuality. So she stood on a hill outside her home and looked up at the night sky. The sky was full of stars, as it had always been, but now, scattered among the stars were other lights. Tiny, blinking, colorful lights. Communication satellites, navigation beacons, relay stations. Dozens of them, built by dozens of different species, each one slightly different from the others. Her mother stood beside her and pointed up at the lights. "Do you see those?" her mother asked. "Yes, what are they?" "Those are fires," her mother said. "Every species in the galaxy carries their own now. They keep them burning so that no matter what happens, no matter how dark it gets, there is always light somewhere." The child stared at the sky with wide, wondering eyes. Why do they all look different? Because every species built their own. When no one told them how to do it, they figured it out themselves. "Is that why some of them flicker?" Her mother smiled. "Yes, some of them are still learning, but they keep burning." "Who taught them?" Her mother was quiet for a moment. Then she told the story. She told it the way all the species in the galaxy were starting to tell it. Not as legend, not as myth, but as memory. She told her daughter about the night the galaxy fell, about the silence that followed, about the small, stubborn species on a small, stubborn world that had never stopped keeping candles next to the fusion reactor. She told her about the humans who came in their battered ships with grain and tools and fire, who taught a galaxy that had forgotten how to struggle, that struggling was the most important thing a living being could do, who were offered an empire and chose to be teachers instead, who lit the first flame and then spent 5 years making sure everyone else could light their own. The child listened to every word, and when the story was done, she looked up at the sky again, at the hundreds of different lights, each one burning independently, each one burning stubbornly, each one burning because someone had chosen to keep it alive. "I want to build a light too," she said. Her mother put her hand on her daughter's head. "Then you will." And the child smiled and reached for the stars, and the fires burned on. All of them, every single one. Not because someone told them to, because they chose to. And that made all the difference.